Casket of former President George H.W. Bush makes its way to the Capitol. We are awaiting that ceremony at the Capitol in just about 15 minutes from now. But joining us right now is a man who, like President George H.W. Bush, also ran the CIA. It's former Director John Brennan. Director Brennan, I think one of the most underreported sections of George H.W. Bush's life is his time as director of the CIA. And I want to read the letter that you and other former directors released over the weekend, because it reminded me of this extraordinary period in which he led the CIA. You wrote, as he approached that position as head of the CIA, as he did everything in his life as a duty and an honor to serve, he assumed the role when the CIA was experiencing great turmoil. He quickly strengthened morale among the agency workforce and confidence in the CIA throughout government. Although his tenure was short, the impact on the agency is indelible. This 1999 naming of the CIA headquarters compound, the George Bush Center for Intelligence, was a fitting gesture to honor a man who embodied all that is best in public service. His leadership was the North Star that we all tried to emulate during our time at the agency. What did he mean to the CIA, Director Brennan?
Well, he meant a lot, Nicole. He was director for less than a year. I think it was just almost a year. But he always referred to it as one of the most cherished periods of his professional life. He enjoyed working with CIA employees. He wanted to understand as much as he could about the mission of intelligence. And it was a tough time for the agency. There was a lot of turmoil after a number of the congressional hearings and exposure of some of the CIA activities. And he brought a sense of leadership and confidence. And it was something that was, I think, much appreciated by the men and women of the CIA. In early 2016, we brought him back to CIA headquarters to celebrate the 40th anniversary of his swearing in as director of CIA. And he spent about 4 or 5 hours out of the agency. And he was just welcomed with open arms by the entire workforce. There were long lines of people as he went down the corridors of Langley in his wheelchair. And people were just glad-handing him and just applauding him, because he really represented, I think, the best of this country from the standpoint of selfless sacrifice. So when he became vice president and when he became president, he looked to the agency to provide him the insights, the information, the analysis that he needed in order to ensure that the decisions he was making on behalf of the country were as informed and as reasoned and as enlightened as possible.
Director Brennan, what did it mean to the CIA to have someone who understood the intelligence product, who understood the intelligence community's selflessness, really facelessness in many jobs there, as their ultimate customer when he became president? There's been so much said in the last 3 days about his foreign policy accomplishments. How did his understanding of the intelligence and his ability to think and see things the way you all do help him execute his foreign policy?
Well, first of all, I think it forced the CIA to be at the very top of this game, because here he is, a former director of CIA, former envoy to China, 8 years as vice president, and then becomes president. And so he understood exactly what the intelligence capabilities were. He understood the strengths and weaknesses. He knew the world. He knew many of the world leaders at the time. So we were having to give a very, very well-informed and smart and intelligent consumer the best intelligence possible. I remember going into the Oval Office for my first time back in October of 1990, shortly after Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. And it was an intimidating experience for me to sit down with the President of the United States, and one who was so steeped in foreign affairs. But he couldn't have been more gracious. He couldn't have been more welcoming. And he felt as though the CIA was a place that was his home, and he relied on it heavily. He challenged us. He made sure that we were doing what we needed to do in order to keep this country safe and secure. But to have someone in the Oval Office who valued the work of the intelligence professionals, who understood the complexities of these world events, it was something that I think all CIA officers, ever since then, have truly respected in George H.W. Bush.
What is his loss, not just his death, but the loss of a period when our politics were populated by people like him, who spent their career in the government, in public service. What is that moment like? How has that changed the way the CIA does their job?
Well, I think as people have said over the last several days, it is the passing of a generation. Someone who was in World War II, who had seen such transformation around the world, but also was part of a political environment in Washington where you can work with your political adversaries, but do it in a way that continues to reflect the values and the principles of this country. And so with his passing from the scene, even though over the years, the last several years, he was less and less active, but he still symbolized I think, a special time in our lives. And having somebody like that who actually worked at Langley and who walked the corridors of Langley, I think CIA officers, women and men, just felt extremely proud that one of their own was in the Oval Office and then was such a revered and respected statesman. I think it's caused many to reflect upon the days when you have people like George H.W. Bush, who really is a beacon in many respects and a model for how individuals who aspire to and ascend to such positions of authority carry out their responsibilities with tremendous dignity and humility.
Director Brennan, thank you so much for getting on the phone and spending some time with us. We're grateful.
Thanks, Nicole.
Joining the conversation now is Steve Schmidt, my former colleague, someone who has worked for the Bush family. Steve, just talk about this moment for the Bush family losing its patriarch 8 months after losing its matriarch, and just how different this moment is. You see, I don't know, I guess we call them the deep state now, assembled inside the halls of the Capitol to honor the 41st president. And I think at the core, it might be because he honored and valued them.
I think it's an enormously important moment for the country, Nicole, when we look at the life of George Herbert Walker Bush, this titanic figure, this American statesman, a giant. His life spanned 3/4 of the American century, born in 1924. The man who presided over the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Empire. A person who was a peerless wartime commander-in-chief. Not since FDR did you see such competence in the Oval Office with the deployment of the United States military into harm's way. A figure of decency and goodness. Somebody who went to work every day with one goal in mind, to make his country more prosperous and its people more secure. To make the country better for the Americans not yet born. And it's a remarkable life. When we think about 2018, I think it stands mentioning that this marks the death of the youngest combat pilot in the Pacific theater of the Second World War at age 94. The passing of the last of the World War II generation as President of the United States. And when we ponder our politics of division, its vulgarity, its cruelty, what George Herbert Walker Bush is being remembered for this week isn't a tweet or isn't a press release or nothing much more than his fundamental character, his decency. And for a long time in this country, we've been told around our politics that, well, character doesn't matter so much. But what we celebrate in this country at this hour is the celebration of character, of virtue. And all of the virtues that define this man's life are fundamentally the virtues that are necessary for the sustainment and prosperity of a great nation.
Steve Schmidt, I think it's fair to say that this moment in our politics is hard on the Bush family and people that served them. With that being said, Donald Trump has exhibited he has had some respectful words for George H.W. Bush, and it's just been handed to me that the Trumps are expected to pay their respects at the Capitol tonight. This seems to me to be George H.W. Bush's last gift to the office of the presidency to lift Donald Trump up?
Well, this is an office with so much majesty around it. When we watch, as John Meacham said earlier, the state, the celebration of state, the remembrance of this life, the majesty. This is one of 44 human beings who has served as president of the United States in the history of the American Republic. He did so in consequential times. He gave his full measure to the country. He conducted himself with decency and dignity. And so in this hour of vulgarity, we look at the remembrance of his life, and I think it's a reflection back into the country that though they may be missing from our political class, the virtues of decency and goodness are on display and exhibited every minute of every hour of every day in America. When he talked about the 1,000 points of light, what he was saying is that across all the country, from the inner city to our most rural towns, there are Americans doing great things, doing decent things, doing good things. And he was a man who I think Americans understood typified the best of all of us, the best of all of our capacity for decency and goodness.
He also, Karen Tumulty, he also is being remembered in some of the same ways by members of the media. There was an extraordinary piece of writing today from Maureen Dowd, and if you worked in the Bush family, you knew that the relationship between them was something of a legend, and really wasn't much anyone could do about it. She would write what she would write, but you don't see that, and if there are warm spots and warm relationships between politicians and members of the media, most politicians are pretty careful not to let anyone find out.
Yes, and it was a tendentious relationship, not just among the news reporters who covered the White House, but, you know, a lot of the opinion columnists were incredibly hard on George Herbert Walker Bush. And so, as you might recall, there were buttons and bumper stickers during the 1992 campaign that said, "Annoy the media, vote for Bush." Mm-hmm. And I think, you know, again, that it was not like it was a smooth relationship all the time, but there was a certain kind of grace to it and a certain respect, I think, on both sides to sort of the responsibilities that come with the job. And it's, I think, really, you know, as I was writing the obituary for our newspaper, it occurred to me that when you write these obituaries, you really do have to be very cognizant of the context in which they land. And I think that his death, it's just impossible not to view both his death and his life against the context of where America is right now and the context of what the presidency is like right now.
Everyone's being really careful and respectful. We were watching an image of the 41st president's casket as it is being driven via motorcade in the presidential limo. Most presidents call that the beast because of its size and weight. But I think what everyone's getting at is that under Donald Trump, the office of the presidency has been debased in a way that is unimaginable for people who served every past president.
It is. It's different. We're living in a different time. George Bush 41, his body will be carried up the steps of the east front of the Capitol. The casket will be placed on the very same catafalque that Abraham Lincoln's casket was placed on. It is exactly the dignity of the office that we are about to witness here in a few moments.
And this isn't a law, this is a tradition. And I think what's lost in this moment is our reverence and our dependence and the way we need and rely upon the elegance and the traditions of the presidency.
It is. Now, in the last 72 hours, Donald Trump has paid at least notional respect to that dignity.
Correct.
He canceled his press conference in South America. He sent Air Force One to get the body of George Bush. He's going to attend but not speak at the funeral. But I would say, Nicole, that is not a gift that Donald Trump is giving us. That is a gift that George Bush 41 is giving us.
Correct.
Because George Bush has included Donald Trump, a man with whom there is great contrast and, frankly, probably great disagreement between the families. Bush 41's last gift to us, as you said, is to invite the Trump family into his very last service.
And it is so Bush 41 to lift up everyone. Joining us now, my colleague Chris Matthews, host of Hardball. Chris, your coverage Saturday night and today has been remarkable. Now the moment is here, the casket carrying the 41st president about to be carried up the steps of the Capitol.
Yeah, and I was listening to David there, and I thought, when I worked at the Hill, I used to take people down, way down into the bottom of the Capitol, inside the Capitol, way down, the lowest floor. And down there is where the catafalque was kept all those years since the days of Lincoln. It was originally going to be the grave site for the George Washington and Martha Washington. They chose instead their family to bury their loved ones out at Mount Vernon. But it's all so much about the Capitol. It is the first article of the government of Constitution. It is where our government really resides, not the White House. It's the Capitol. Capitol policemen will die for that building. I know that because I used to be one of them. It is a revered spot. It is the heart of our democracy. And here's George Bush coming back to it, a servant of the state, if you will. Nobody's had as many jobs as he's had. Everything. U.S. Congress, he was CIA, he was a Republican National Committee, he was ambassador to China, he was vice president, he was president. He did it all. He loved it. I hate phrases like the deep state because it suggests that they're apart from us. And of course, these all people will bear witness to the fact that he was representing the American people. And there's Dick Cheney and the rest of them. What an amazing group of people who've survived all this. And I think it's about service. And I know President Trump, I don't think, understands it. He doesn't understand that people come to this city of Washington to serve the country, that they're there as representatives of the people, and they know it. And that 21-gun salute, as I said a while ago, was a tribute to the head of state, the person who personifies this country at the top, not just the head of the government or the Congress or holder of the presidency or the chief executive, but the head of state. And I think Bush, and you know this, better than any president, understood the honor of the office. Just like Ronald Reagan would never walk into the Oval Office without his coat on. I don't think in any spiritual way George Herbert Walker Bush ever saw any part of the presidency that didn't deserve reverence. And as he was once asked, what's the greatest thing about being president? And he answered the best possible answer. He said the honor of it.
And
that explains everything we feel today.
We were not, if we went to work in the White House on a Saturday or a Sunday, whether we were going to be inside the Oval Office or not, we always had to wear a suit. I mean, the office was to be revered. And even if we were called in at the last minute to put together a pool for a surprise trip to Iraq or Afghanistan, no matter the short notice, we had to put on a suit. Men had to put on a coat and tie to be anywhere near that West Wing.
Because we represent the American people. It's a Republican form of government. It means we're here to represent the people in any capacity. The people who elect people have a right to be represented as honorably as possible. And that's what it's about. And I think we get into this tribal political warfare and we forget what the job is, which is to represent the American people. And I think Bush Sr. really knew how to do that. And he was, the funny things was, because you're talking about, I have to talk about the letter writing is a riot, because 1988 is when I came out with the book Hardball. The show's named after that, of course. And he wrote me a letter. He went through each page in the book and numbered the pages he was mentioned on. This is so Washington. And he mentioned at page 7, page 22, and all the numbers of the page. And he said, having escaped unscathed, I'll read the rest of your book.
He was
That is so Washington.
We talked about his letters as love bombs, that when you received one, you felt like the most important person in the world. I think a lot of people who are out there today were on the receiving end of love bombs from this president.
He also did the same with my parents. When I'll say this story, I guess I'm going to say it at the end of the show tonight, when he invited me to a movie at the White House with Kathleen, my wife, and my parents were visiting town from their own way back from Florida. I guess it was in the spring, and I wasn't going to go without them. So I found a way through Lois Romano, a reporter at the time with the Washington Post. I finagled an invitation. Actually, it wasn't finagling. The president said, okay, bring your mom and dad. So we get to the White House. We go upstairs to the family area, and there he was, dressed for a club event for fun. He looked great. He had a blazer on, great pants. It was evening attire. And he took my dad and mom on the most amazing tour, just the two of them. And they never forgot it. My dad said that night, the greatest night of his life. I owe that, our family does, to this president we've just lost.
So let's watch, Chris, as they get ready to take the casket carrying the body of the 41st president of the United States, George Herbert Walker Bush, up the steps of the Capitol, where he will lay in state.
I can only imagine what he's thinking right now. A very gracious entrance, to say the least. But it's still his father, his dad, the one that reared him, the one that brought him into the world. Choreographically perfect. Perfect. Sad that this family's gone through this same ordeal now twice. Their mother, about 7 months later, the father. The Golden Jubilee, they have passed. It's almost like a sign in and of itself. I had one to make mention of an omen, to see both of them fall in the same year. A great legend, a great leader, a great era is coming to its end. What does the 21st century, beginning in 2019, hold for not only the Americans but the rest of the world in our adventurous achievements that we must make, going where no man hath gone before? Recognizing that the old has now come to its end, and it's time for the new to bring into the beginning. One of the greatest nations in the world, America, that not only honors its living, but also honors its dead. I only know personally of 2 individuals that fought in World War II that is still living. That era has come to its end. That thinking, that concept, that persona of how to do things. is steadily being ushered out. As the sun is setting, it's a beautiful day for a beautiful ceremony. One of the greatest nations in the world, the Americans.
Ceremonial at peace.
Good evening. I'm Chuck Todd here on Capitol Hill in Washington. We, of course, are continuing our special coverage. As a nation remembers and mourns the loss of President George H.W. Bush, this is a service at the U.S. Capitol that is beginning literally right now. President Bush's remains have just entered the Capitol, and let's watch.
Let us pray. We give you thanks, Almighty God, for the appearance among us of great men and women who serve as inspirations for all Americans to be their best in service to God, country, and neighbor. This day, we honor our 41st President, George H.W. Bush. President Bush dedicated his entire life to public service as a vocation, first in the military, then as a member of Congress, a diplomat, director of the CIA, vice president, and finally, president. It is a record of service reminiscent of John Quincy Adams and unmatched in nearly a century. Wow. We thank you, O God, for having endowed President Bush with noblesse oblige, and ask that his example of service to others might be an inspiration to all Americans, indeed to all the world. As we continue this celebration of honor, grant that all who attend to these proceedings might be desirous of being our best selves in service to all our brothers and sisters, as you might call us to be. Dear Lord, thank you for inspiring such greatness in President George H.W. Bush, and continue to bless the United States of America. Amen.
That was the House chaplain. You're about to hear 3 eulogies, starting with Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, then the Speaker of the House, and then the Vice President.
30 years ago, on the west front of this Capitol, George Herbert Walker Bush addressed the nation for the first time as our president. He said, "We meet on democracy's front porch, a good place to talk as neighbors and as friends." The words of a humble servant who loved his fellow citizens, and of a principled leader who knew America not only guards our own future, but also safeguards democracy for the world. Today, this hero has returned to the Capitol a final time, not on the front porch of our democracy this time, but here in its hallowed cathedral, beneath paintings that tell the story of our land and our liberty, and flanked by statues of his fellow champions whom he joined in making that story possible. George Bush was just a teenager when he volunteered for military service and became the Navy's youngest aviator. He was only 20 on that September day in 1944 when his plane was hit on a bombing run. But through the fire and smoke, George Bush stayed steady at the controls. Only once he accomplished his mission did he parachute out over the Pacific. A steady hand, staying the course. That's what George Bush gave us for decades. Decorated aviator, congressman, ambassador to the United Nations, envoy to China, CIA director, 8 years as vice president, and our commander-in-chief. Through the Cold War and the Soviet Union's collapse, he kept us on course. When the rule of law needed defending in the Persian Gulf, he kept us on course. With his even temperament and hard-won expertise, George Herbert Walker Bush steered this country as straight as he steered that airplane. He kept us flying high and challenged us to fly higher still. And he did it with modesty and kindness that would have been surprising in someone 1/10 as tough and accomplished as he was. The patriot who lies before us was blessed with many gifts, but there was no doubt which he prized most of all. A great love story began at that Christmas dance when George Bush met Barbara Pierce, and the grace and virtue they taught their children have enriched this nation through a family of leaders. Today, the nation stands with that family, with our 43rd president, with Jeb, Neil, Marvin, and Doro, and all the Bush grandchildren and great-grandchildren. We stand with you in mourning, but also in gratitude. Gratitude for lives well lived and duties thoroughly fulfilled. Gratitude that God gave this country George and Barbara Bush, and that they may now be reunited in the light of his grace.
Amen.
As Americans, we have no more solemn duty than laying a great patriot to rest. Here lies a great man. To the Bush family, on behalf of the whole House, Republicans and Democrats, we are profoundly sorry for your loss.
Absolutely.
And we are honored to celebrate this wonderful life with you.
Right.
Like so many, I feel a personal debt of gratitude today. A sentiment no doubt countless millions of Americans are feeling at this moment. The 1988 campaign, that was the first one I was ever involved in. We handed out literature at the Janesville Craig Cougar ball games and at the Rock County 4-H fair. I remember going to this big rally at Miami of Ohio the day after the first debate. The whole experience really drew me into politics. He was the first president I had the chance to vote for. And he was the first president to teach me and many of us that in a democracy, sometimes you fall short.
Sometimes.
And that how you handle that is just as important as how you win.
Absolutely.
An old preacher once said, "Grace is but glory begun, and glory is but grace perfected." Grace is but glory begun, and glory is but grace perfected.
Right.
Glory is transcendent in the life of our republic.
You got that right.
This rotunda is a trumpet call to glory.
Yes.
Tributes to the giants all the way up into the sky. Grace is different. It's more elemental. It is not larger than life. It is the stuff of life.
Absolutely.
The connective tissue in a free society. It deepens the well of our common humanity. Throughout his life of service, President Bush personified grace. His character was second to none. He reached the heights of power with uncommon humility. He made monumental contributions to freedom with a fundamental decency that resonates across generations. No one better harmonized the joy of life and the duty of life. There's that indelible image of him as Commander-in-Chief during the Gulf War, waving to a sea of troops during a visit during Thanksgiving. There are all these images we have of him as a devoted husband. That twinkle in his eye that Barbara always brought out, especially in those big, huge family photos you all had in Kennebunkport. This one I will never forget. There was that image of him as a loving father reaching out to hold his son's hand at the National Cathedral after 9/11. There's this letter he wrote his children on the last day of 1990 as he wrestled with a decision over Operation Desert Storm. He begins by recounting the family Christmas, and he apologized if he seemed distracted. I tried not to be, he writes. Then for about a page, he elaborates on his struggle over sending young Americans into harm's way. Twice in the letter, he writes, "Every human life is precious." And the original copy, he adds by hand a note wishing his family a new year. In consequential times, George Herbert Walker Bush demonstrated the finest qualities of our nation and of humankind. A great leader and a good man. A gentle soul of firm resolve. He showed us that how we live is as important as what we achieve.
Absolutely.
His life was a hymn of honor. His legacy is grace perfected. His memory will belong to glory. God bless the 41st President of the United States.
I'm going to miss him. Why in the world he decided to bow out is beyond me.
Speaker Ryan, Leader McConnell, Leader Schumer, Leader Pelosi, members of Congress, distinguished guests, but most of all, President George W. Bush, Governor Jeb Bush, Neil, Marvin, Doral, and the entire Bush family. It is deeply humbling to stand before you today at the beginning of a week in our nation's capital when we will commemorate and celebrate the lifetime of service and leadership of the 41st President of the United States, President George Herbert Walker Bush. The Bible tells us to mourn with those who mourn and grieve with those who grieve. And today, on behalf of the First Family and my family and the American people, we offer our deepest sympathies.
Absolutely.
And respects to your family. And we thank you for sharing this special man with our nation and the world. Today, President Bush becomes the 32nd American to lie in state in the United States Capitol Rotunda. Soon, Americans from every corner of the country and every walk of life will make their way to this rotunda to pay the respects of a grateful nation. Upon the death of Abner, it is written that King David said, "Do you not realize that a commander and a great man has fallen in Israel this day?" George Herbert Walker Bush was such a man. While he was known as the quiet man, it was not for lack of nerve or daring. For in all of his 94 years, President Bush never lost his love of adventure. And he never failed to answer the call to serve his country. Born into a tradition of public service, George Herbert Walker Bush began his own life of service when he was still in high school. After the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, he wanted to do his part, so he enlisted in the United States Navy on his 18th birthday. On receiving his wings, he became the nation's youngest naval aviator and was sent to the South Pacific, where his story almost ended. September 1944, on a bombing raid over Chichijima, his aircraft was hit. His engine caught fire, but he still managed to hit his target before bailing out and being rescued by American forces after some 4 hours at sea. All told, he flew 58 combat missions. And for his bravery under fire, he earned the Distinguished Flying Cross, which would have been enough honor for any American life. But George Herbert Walker Bush was just getting started. After he came home, he staked his claim to a booming post-war America by making a name for himself in the oil business. For 4 years, he walked these halls as a congressman from Houston. President Nixon took notice of the young Texan and asked him to be our ambassador to the United Nations. He led our party during a tumultuous time for the presidency, and after earning the respect of another president, he did the work of a diplomat as the first United States envoy to China and led the CIA. And then, for 8 years, George Herbert Walker Bush served as the 43rd Vice President of the United States. I'm told as he was preparing to become Vice President, he once joked about the job, saying that there was, quote, "nothing substantive to do at all." But as history records, during those years, he set the standard as a sound counselor and loyal advisor to an outsider who came to Washington, D.C. to shake things up, cut taxes, rebuild the military, and together they did just that. And then, in 1988, he made history again, when George Herbert Walker Bush was elected in a landslide as the 41st President of the United States of America, becoming the first sitting Vice President to win the presidency in more than 150 years of our history. He served during an uncertain time in the world, made momentous by his leadership. President Bush oversaw the fall of the Soviet Union, the crumbling of the Berlin Wall, and under his leadership, America won the Cold War. He took our nation to war to repel aggression in the Persian Gulf, and through his leadership as Commander-in-Chief and the brilliance of our armed forces, the United States won a decisive victory. When President George Herbert Walker Bush left office, he left America and the world more peaceful, prosperous, and secure. President Bush was a great leader who made a great difference in the life of this nation. But he was also just a good man who was devoted to his wife, his family, and his friends. I was lucky enough to meet him in 1988 when he was vice president, and I was a 29-year-old just getting started in politics. Then, as always, I was struck by his approachability. There was a kindness about the man that was evident to everyone who ever met him. All his years in public service were characterized by kindness, modesty, and patriotism. He was so modest, in fact, that he never wrote an autobiography. But he did leave a record of his life in the thousands of letters that he wrote. I'm told that he started writing letters to his parents when he was 18 years old. And over time, his circle of correspondence grew to include family, friends, advisors, staff, business associates, former presidents, and just about anyone who would take the trouble to write to him. After a lifetime of writing letters, my son got one just not too long ago. As I told two of his sons this weekend, when our son made his first tailhook landing as a Marine aviator on the USS George Herbert Walker Bush, I took the liberty of writing the ship's namesake to ask for a small favor. I didn't write him as a vice president to a former president. I just wrote as a proud dad of a Marine aviator to a former Navy pilot. I asked him to sign a picture of the flight deck that I could give to my son. Now, we were told by the staff that the president had long since ended the practice of signing autographs, and we understood that. But little to my surprise, just in time for my son's winging, there came not only a signed photograph, but, of course, a letter, hand-signed as well, August 2018. In that letter, President Bush wrote to my son, in his words, "Congratulations on receiving your wings of gold. I know how proud you and your family are at this moment." And then, in words that assured us that the letter came directly from him, he wrote, quote, "Though we have not met, I share the pride your father has for you during this momentous occasion, and I wish you many CAVU days ahead. All the best, G. Bush." I would come to learn that acronym, CAVU for short, is a term Navy pilots have used since World War II. It stands for Ceiling and Visibility Unlimited. President Bush described CAVU, in his words, as the kind of weather we Navy pilots wanted when we were to fly off our carrier in the Pacific. And he once wrote a letter to his children saying that CAVU, in his words, describes my own life as it's been over the years and as it is right now. Ceiling and visibility unlimited. Now, that may well describe the essence of this man. And it may well have been his vision. The vision he had for his life, for his children, his children's children, and his country. No barriers, no boundaries, no limits. So we mourn with those who mourn and grieve with those who grieve. But we do not grieve like those who have no hope.
Absolutely.
For President George Herbert Walker Bush had that hope.
Yes.
His faith sustained him throughout his life of service, and we pray that faith will be a source of comfort for all those who mourn the loss of this good man and great American. President George Herbert Walker Bush loved his family, and he served his country. His example will always inspire, and his lifetime of service will be enshrined in the hearts of the American people forever. May God bless the memory of George Herbert Walker Bush. May God comfort his family and friends. And may God continue to bless the United States of America.
There are those three eulogies there from the three official leaders of Congress, the head of the Senate, the head of the House, and of course the president there of the Senate. Now we're about to hear from the Naval Academy Glee Club here, and we will let that play out as well.
Oh, beautiful for spacious skies, for amber waves of grain, for purple mountain majesties of the rosy plain. America, America, God shed His grace on thee, and crown thy good with brotherhood from sea to shining sea. Oh, beautiful for heroes proved in liberating strife, who more than self their country loved, and a mercy on and life. America, America, may God thy gold refine till all success be nobleness, and every
We're about to see a few wreaths about to be laid in bipartisan fashions by the bipartisan heads of the House and the Senate. Michael Beschloss, presidential historian, is here with me. And Michael, this is an opportunity for the entire American public to say goodbye to George H.W. Bush. Everything else, there's sort of velvet ropes around.
Right.
You know, we're the family. But this is the moment for everybody. This is the people's capital. And they're going to be able to go through this tonight as soon as this official part of the ceremony is over.
You will see lines of people going in here and paying their last respects. You know, it reminds me of after John Kennedy was in exactly the same place. You know, his remains were also on the Lincoln catafalque, just as George Bush's are tonight. You know, all through the night they streamed in, and people would look at the crowds and sort of say, you know, why are you here? And every single one would give a different story.
It's beautiful moments. Ann Compton, you covered this president very closely. One of my great joys was working with you during the Obama White House years when I was in there, and you were at another network. George H.W. Bush, what would you think? He appreciated these moments. He knew that America needed moments like this.
Even though I think personally he might be a little uncomfortable sitting listening to all the tributes, but Chuck, the warmth and grace of the tributes to George Herbert Walker Bush over the last almost 72 hours. Now suddenly this moment seems to be a moment of exquisite pain, especially for that family sitting there. They're the only ones in chairs. The rest of the audience is standing, and especially for President George W. Bush, who is now facing the reality, sitting there looking at his father's casket. And in that face you and I've known so well, a moment of real stress, and it's all really becoming real to him.
It is. It's a who's who of the Republican Party. Michael Steele, former chairman of the Republican Party, also here with us as well. Michael, I assume you were a young man when he was the head of the Republican Party.
Yeah, a very
You're still a young man.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. No, really, I mean, the fact that this weekend there was a lot of talk about all the very big federal things that he did as vice president, president, CIA. But what I took note of is what he did at a very critical time for the country as chairman of the Republican National Committee when Watergate is breaking out all around him. He steered that ship. He made sure that the party survived beyond that presidency, and it spoke to his leadership in so many ways. Leadership that we really wouldn't really begin to appreciate until now. And actually, at the last cabinet meeting of Richard Nixon, when no one was, everyone was dodging the issue, which was, will Nixon stay or go? George Bush, as chairman of the Republican Party, says to Nixon in front of all these other cabinet members, I think you should resign. Made Nixon furious.
Yeah. What's interesting about watching all of this now is the fact that George H.W. Bush didn't like when people talked about him. He was always trying to move. I mean, it's my favorite anecdote now is the interview that Jenna Bush did with her grandfather, and he said that historians would talk about the mistakes that I made and hopefully point out the successes that we had. I and we. And this is the ultimate we.
It's the definition of a presidency, and it's a definition of the man himself in many respects.
And look at the vast resume that he brought to the presidency. He had been in that rotunda as a member of Congress. He had done the other cabinet level positions. He'd been the ambassador to China. And when he took over in 1989, the world changed during those 4 years.
Sure did.
Unrecognizable by the end of his 4-year term.
I don't think even we as a country understood we needed somebody with that much preparation. Right. You think about it, boy, I hope we have a former ambassador to the United Nations in the job. Oh, I hope we have a former ambassador to China in the job. Oh, I hope we have a former... I mean, in that moment, Michael Beschloss, it's sort of like, it's a good thing that happened when we had the person with the most experience possible.
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, looking back as an historian, if I look at the years from 1989 to 1993 and say, what do I want in a president? I want someone with that kind of experience who knows why Germany is divided and knows how important it is to try to get the Soviet Union to open the Berlin Wall and let Eastern Europe be free, and also who knows to deal with the opposition in Congress, because George Bush never had a situation where he was dealing with his own party in control of Congress.
I'm trying to think, he didn't even get 2 years with the Republican Senate.
No, not
he had a Democratic House and Senate the entire time.
And if you look at the transcript of George Bush's inaugural address, just before he gives the formal part of the speech, you see the transcript. It says, "Hey, Danny." And he's waving to Dan Rostenkowski. Even at that moment, he's beginning to try to build bridges.
He was well liked by members of Congress, but he wasn't feared. And I wonder whether he didn't have the leverage during those 4 years that could have gotten him farther with even his modest program and his agenda.
Well, if you look,
I want to weigh in right there. I think that the reason why that those changes occurred
was going to do that
in that period of time is simply because the internet working through the computer system was basically taking off in astronomical degrees to the point that it was socially connecting everybody together to the point that now, instead of we finding out days or weeks later towards what was going on in other heads of state in other countries, now we was finding these things out almost as quickly as they was. In other words, communications had really intensified to the degree that where we are today. Just like right now, there's hundreds of millions, probably over a billion, maybe even a couple billion people that are watching this at the same time that we're watching this right now on MSNBC, being processed and programmed all over the world. And if they're not watching it right now, instantly, they're watching it as it gets edited and goes out later on. And who's to say that the picture that we're looking at right now may not have been edited in several minutes of elapse. That way, if there's a mistake or if there's something that goes on, that maybe our editors can edit that out to where it's not such of an embarrassing
strong to save
thing for everybody to look at, because you don't really never know what's going to occur during these moments.
And have our being. We praise you for your generous providence that provided our nation and world with the gift of your servant, President George Herbert Walker Bush. Lord, we're grateful for the privilege you gave us to learn and grow from his integrity, kindness, heroism, courage, excellence, service, intellect, humility, civility, and spirituality. As we celebrate this well-lived life, challenge us, O God, to also leave the world better than we found it. Continue to comfort those who mourn. Touch each member of the Bush family with your mercy, love, and grace. And God, support us all the day long until the shadows lengthen and the evening comes and the busy world lies hushed and the fever of life is over and our work is done. Then in your mercy, grant us a safe lodging and a holy rest and a peace at last. We pray in the name of George Herbert Walker Bush's Savior and friend, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Now see the family paying their respects first, and then you're going to see the public. You'll start to see everybody passing through, but of course the family will be paying their respects first. So the family being escorted out, Michael Beschloss, and now we will start to see people filing both out, filing around, paying their respects. And, you know, for these, it's interesting, I've always wondered what it's for this first family to have to publicly mourn. And you wonder, and I just sit there and ache for them, when do they get to privately mourn? You know, when do they get to have their own moment? Because this is tough to be, to everybody watching you, and you probably feel as if every moment you're being watched and you're Bush, or you've probably been brought up to realize this. And so I know they know how to handle this moment as a family, but it's to publicly mourn when you need some private time is probably tough.
Right, and the ones I've talked to, members of presidential families who've been through this, what you tend to hear from them is that during the days of public ceremonies, it's almost a help that they have to be in public, and walk the right way and look the right way and say the right things. But then once the spotlight is off and this is all over, they say it's 2 or 3 times as bad.
And what it must be like at Kennebunkport next summer, with both the loss of Barbara Bush and George Bush. Yet all the family, they all have houses there, they will all still make that a mecca. But when that generation goes, the center kind of, you lose the center doesn't hold. And for a family this devoted to each other, it's very, very painful.
We have Trent Lott joining us. Trent Lott was in the House leadership during the Reagan-Bush era, became a senator, I believe, during the Bush presidency. I hope I've got got all of that correct. So he has spent a lot of time both with Vice President Bush, President Bush, you name it, and he was obviously in that ceremony. Senator Lott, I know he was a friend of yours. My condolences to you for losing a friend. But just give me your thoughts on today's ceremony.
Well, first of all, I think this is a moment of unity. You saw Republicans and Democrats there together and all praising him for the job he did for our country, but for being a good man. And I think it's a moment that the country needed. I hope it won't end this week. This was a great man. He served his country so well. And I hope maybe we can learn some lessons from the life he lived and from the outpouring of appreciation and love that we've seen this week.
Take me into those days in the 80s and 90s there. He seemed to be a guy who thought, well, give me a deal that's possible rather than setting terms that are impossible. Is that fair?
It is fair. He believed in getting the job done and doing the right thing for the country. Sometimes it's painful. Sometimes if you're president, you have to make a tough decision that hurts you politically or puts our men and women at risk overseas in a worthy cause. He met the tough task, he made the decisions, and he paid some prices for it along the way. But I always admired the fact that he would make the tough decision, and I always appreciated his affability. I had the occasion a couple of years ago to go with former Senator Judd Gregg to Kennebunkport to see the president and Barbara. That very morning, he'd been out on a cigarette.
You have to always admire the simplicity of one individual, regardless of who they may be, in regard of having to be liable and accountable for so many other lives other than their own. People that's in these positions, it doesn't matter if you're a governor or a lieutenant governor or a senator or a congressman or a president or a vice president. You have to admire the fact of what they say and do, not only in the public eye but also in the private eye, has a profound effect, or can have a profound effect, upon to thousands, if not millions, of people's lives because of the position that they either currently or have currently held or are going to hold. So you have to give homage to the position of great gratitude that our system is set up the way that it is. And it's not just a third world bully type tyranny government to the point that the person with the strongest guns or the biggest guns or the fastest guns are the ones on top. Kind of similar to the way that they was operating back years and years ago during the Wild Wild West days over here in America, before that they had become colonized in doing things that is now considered more acceptable in a civilized society. I realize a lot of this is showmanship, but it has meaning pertaining to whatever association that these people may be in, regardless whether it be in the armed forces or Navy or the Marines or
or whatever, it all holds a certain key character to who they are, what they believe in, why they're there, and it's all pertaining to being a good subservient to their people.
Millions of Americans of any political stripe, really just astonishing. And, you know, as you listen to, and I listen to Speaker Ryan and the Vice President eulogize George H.W. Bush, you just wonder if they're not, you know, eulogizing this way of doing politics. I think, you know, a lot of people here at the Capitol, you know, this is a frustrating time to try to be doing big things on behalf of the country under the Trump administration. And so, you know, I think that we're all sort of grappling with this and whether or not it really is the end of an era. And I think there are a lot of people who are hoping that maybe it.
Once more, whenever you look at fake news, the way that she presented that, her very statement that she just made right there, was almost shadowing an umbrella of guilt automatically upon to Donald Trump and upon to Donald Trump's administration. Why is it that these commentators that are supposed to be spokesmen for the people can't enlighten us in the degree of, well, there are difficult circumstances going on right now based around the consequences that has occurred over the past 3 or 4 administrations that has put Donald Trump and his administration in a very, very uncomfortable situation. How come they can't tell the whole truth instead of only parts of the truth, the parts that they want to do a smear tactic in acting like that it's all Trump's fault? It's never been all Trump's fault. Now, does that mean that I agree with everything that Trump has done? Absolutely not. Some of the stuff that he's done is preposterous. Some of the stuff that he has done has been totally unorthodox compared to other prior presidencies. But, you got to look at it from a reality standpoint. We haven't had presidencies that went into power with such great burden that this one now holds in regard to us being trillions and trillions of dollars in debt, all our jobs walked off pertaining to getting the horse in front of the cart or the cart in front of the horse, and us being in financial strain, as well as all our jails and prisons being full, and our medical controversy pertaining to our hospitals overcharging and our medical industries overcharging. We haven't never had a president that had to walk into these type of dire, extreme circumstances. You don't hear that out of a commentator like her. All you hear is, let's back it up. We want to be sure
Doesn't have to.
we record her properly. Right there.
Obviously,
right
he
there.
campaigned, you know, with as sharp of elbows as almost anybody. But he saw a difference between campaigning and governing, and the things that he was able to accomplish when he was in the White House. And frankly, he was working with a Democratic Congress. Big, sweeping accomplishments that made major differences for the millions of Americans of any political stripe. Really just astonishing. And, you know, as you listen to, and I listen to Speaker Ryan and the Vice President eulogize George H.W. Bush, you just wonder if they're not, you know, eulogizing this way of doing politics. I think, you know, a lot of people here at the Capitol, you know, this is a frustrating time to try to be doing big things on behalf of the country under the Trump administration. And
there you go. A frustrating time. Pushing the blame off on that administration. In reality, that's what she's trying to say. Because she's not voicing right now both sides of the perspective, because it's not the appropriate time to be doing so. People are trying to be elegant. People are trying to be graceful. People are trying to be polite and nice. And if anything, it has made the situation pertaining to the death of George H. Walker Bush's life more uncomfortable in this setting because of so many failures that has occurred in prior administrations before the Trump administration and after this man's administration. There is a period of time there of about 25 or 30 years that something has horribly went wrong with the way that we cross our T's and dot our I's for us to be trillions and trillions of dollars in debt. And the blame does not all fall upon to our politicians. The blame falls upon to the circumstances that the politicians had to deal with. The blame has to deal with the people over in the Middle East that declared war upon to the American people, that has costed trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars for more heavy security. You keep in mind the main vein that was hit in 9/11 was the big financial vein, where they exchange 10 chickens for one goat. And it has put a strain upon the financial stability of this country. And to this day, they still have not pinpointed the direct source that has put our lives in peril pertaining to the guilty ones that are still at large. To this day, they're still free. And they're still, I'm surprised they're not over here in one of these settings. And I don't think I have to mention no names.
So, I think that we're all sort of grappling with this and whether or not it really is the end of an era. And I think there are a lot of people who are hoping that maybe it doesn't have to be that way. Chuck.
Thank you, Casey.
Why would you not want it to be? Just like the Bible teaches us, there's a time and a season for everything. There's a time for planting. There's a time for harvest. There's a time for war. There's a time for peace. There's a time for mourning. There's a time for rejoicing. Why would you not want it to be the end of the era of World War II, towards basically saying, okay, this is basically the old, out with the old, and now bring in the new. I think that's part of the problem that the American people in our politics don't understand, that whenever we say in with the new, we're just not talking about changing the name of the entitlement, but we're supposed to change the concept towards how we run things and do things and how we operate things. Because the old machinery that at one time used to work back years ago in the old ship is no longer effective and no longer working today in the new one. Why is that? Because we've got new circumstances. We've got new this, we've got new that. And I'm basically using the planet as a starship by saying the things that we had to be challenged with during World War II, we're no longer challenged with the same challenges. Now we're challenged with things today that they didn't even imagine back then that we was going to have to be confronting in today's modern standards. So unless we're willing to grow and adapt, and yes, evolve, with our thinking, with our practices, with the way that we exchange ideals, unless we're willing to evolve, guess what's going to happen to America? We're going to take second seat, and we're going to be left out in somebody else's dust while they're leading the pack. And that is so sad, because during this man's young, energetic life, America was the leading country in agriculture, the leading country in medicine, the leading country in industrial manufacturing pertaining to the smokestack era. There was so many things that America was just on top of its game. And for some reason, I blame some of it on drugs in the Woodstock era. But the main reason is because of the powers of the dark forces that has come upon to us unexpectedly, to the point that we took our eye off the ball. We put it on cruise control too long. There was nobody navigating the ship. Come on, let's get real with this era that has now come to its final ending place, its final resting place. Like I said earlier, I don't know of maybe a couple people, and I know a lot of people in a lot of different places all over different states that are still living. One of them, he still has his independence to a certain degree. He's 90, I think 93, maybe 92. And the other one has already lost his independence by being in a nursing home. And that's where however many is left of the World War II era has basically been exchanging their life for the past 4, 5, 10 years is in a convalescent home, a nursing home somewhere. But as we're fixing to wrap this up and end this, coming from the Windmill Ministries missions here at 291 Thompson Road, we want to say thank you for allowing for us to be part of your lives in watching this YouTube video, this digital video that we have been honored of capturing supposedly on live TV. I'm pretty sure there's probably at least a 15 to 20, maybe a 30-second delay. That way it could possibly wash out if there was somebody that fell or if there was some sort of an embarrassing moment. It says live, but in reality, I'm pretty sure there's some sort of a delay there. But as we're finishing this up, we want to say thank you, and God bless America.
I think those are important words. As I noted earlier, if they can figure out how to pause their fight over a border wall this week and not shut down the government, then that proves they can not shut down the government anytime they want. On this front, Michael Steele, you want to jump? You're like jumping out of your bones about this.
No, you just hit it right on the head, Chuck. And it's in one sense sad that we have these official ceremonies like this where Washington sort of takes a pause and gets introspective and remember how it used to operate, how it used to function. Times no less partisan in many respects, but it's how the members approach that partisanship.
We thought it was partisan then.
We thought exactly.
We were that was basically my coming of age as a young political journalist was sort of the tail end of the Bush administration. It was partisan. It was very partisan.
Absolutely, and the American people liked divided government when they saw it, and
so they claim. They claim this all the time,
but we've also seen a country where the respect for institutions, the Supreme Court justices just standing there at the side of the casket, some of them appointed by this president, and the kind of a lack of respect for major institutions. A couple of days like this isn't necessarily going to rekindle that warm and fuzzy feeling.
No, it won't. It's interesting you brought up the Supreme Court. It was to watch them all there, not in their robes, which, by the way, it's not very often you see them in public, together, not in their robes. I believe Ruth Bader Ginsburg was not. I don't think she was there, but I think she couldn't stand for this.
Because the audience here was standing.
They had to stand there. Michael Beschloss, what's interesting about even his 2 Supreme Court justices that he named as president, epitomize this straddle that he always straddled between the moderate wing of his party, the New England wing of the party, the Southern wing of the party, the New Englander and Souter, the Southerner and Thomas, the moderate liberal Republican versus the conservative Southern Republican. It's funny, it feels like that's what we're also eulogizing here, is that wing of the party doesn't
that
feel
is
as
gone.
if, yeah.
I mean, he was from Texas, but he was a New England Republican. I mean, he was born in...
And that was a sin to some conservatives.
Yes, absolutely. He was born in Massachusetts, grew up in Greenwich, Connecticut, and it was a very rough thing for him. And as you well know, when he went on to Ronald Reagan's ticket, Ronald Reagan asked that magic question, which was, before I make you vice president, this is December of 1980, I have to know if you're going to run on the platform. And what he was talking about was, above anything else, abortion. And Bush, who had been pro-choice, changed his mind.
But it was interesting about that, though, because that was the first time that issue was actually put into a political context.
Right.
And so to have Reagan make that point was part of his compromise.
Right.
You saw the compromising of this New England republicanism to this emerging conservative push from the South.
Hugh Hewitt's also watching along with us, of course, the Salem Radio Network, an MSNBC and NBC News contributor. Hugh, we're talking about sort of the role George H.W. Bush played in sort of the 2 Republican parties, if you will. He was sort of the head of one, and he would try to bridge the divide between the 2. Fair, in your mind?
Very fair. I wrote for the Post today. I'm a Bush Republican. I was volunteering for him in '78, back when he was running against Ronald Reagan and John Anderson and Howard Baker. And there are a lot of Bushies there still. I must say, though, Chuck, he's our last World War II president. And when I saw those midshipmen singing, I thought of an 18-year-old George H.W. Bush flying an Avenger torpedo bomber 58 times off of a carrier, splashing it down twice. That's before he goes to college. So when he became a commander-in-chief, and his war cabinet was there, Vice President Cheney and Secretary of State Baker, his best friend, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Colin Powell. And then you look forward to the cabinet today. Mike Pompeo served under him as commander-in-chief. General Mattis, or Secretary of Defense Mattis, was under him in the Gulf War, and John Bolton was an assistant attorney general at the Department of Justice. Bushies are everywhere. They haven't gone away. He trained an entire generation. John Roberts was his deputy solicitor general, for goodness sake.
Yeah. Excellent points. You know, Michael Beschloss, you brought up another point, the president's service. You know, it's interesting. When he was president, it was something I believe 4 of the last 5 previous presidents had all served.
Right.
Now, 4 of the last 5 presidents have not served. When I go with Reagan, Clinton, W, Obama, now this one, what are we up to now? I think 5 of the last 6. I get my numbers right here. It is interesting, we're in this sort of, and we do this historically. We go to sort of, I imagine that in 20 years we may have 4 or 5 straight presidents that have military service, but there is something about that too that we're passing. This is our basically only living president with military service now is Jimmy Carter.
Yes, that's exactly right. And I think you can generalize about presidents who have had military service, which is that bloodshed in a major war is not abstract. And these are people who naturally have empathy and they understand what the cost is going to be. And the best example I can think of is if you look at the story of George H.W. Bush, the few days before Desert Storm began in 1991, that January, he was almost heartbroken because he knew what this would mean in a very real sense from his own experience.
And take us back to that you're at that White House doing all-nighters.
For the whole time. And we now see coming into Congress so many new members of Congress who served. There is that new generation coming on there. The president's steadiness during all of the things that were going on, but for the Persian Gulf War, knowing that only the U.S. could have stopped Saddam, knowing it had to be a coalition of the willing with the Arab countries. And I remember the day he came back to the White House lawn. He'd gone up to Camp David with his war council, and he came back and he said how rewarding it was that even the Arab world was united against Saddam Hussein.
And it was during that time it was united. And it needed to be united because he was a ruthless dictator. And he needed to be stopped. But what the world didn't realize, that in Saddam Hussein's rootless leadership, that was what it was required at that time to mandate a certain type of law and order in that region. Once they took him out, it opened up a whole different venue of more problems that nobody either didn't put a pencil to or didn't understand the type of rootlessness that those people are under the spirit of. In other words, their whole concept of thinking in the Middle East, other than a few, is totally different than what the vast majority of the world is. And the reason why is because they're under a demonic, subjectionable spirit of denial. Even your true Orthodox Jews to this day are still looking for the Messiah. So they have totally thrown out the teachings of Christ towards him being the begotten. And they're still under this heathenistic, barbaric, cruel way of life that goes back to the original Judaism law of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And until you can change that concept of those people's thinking and what they are adjusted to in their practices, I'm pretty sure it's going to continue to be nothing but wars and rumors of wars over in that area until you can prove to them that they are the bad guys and people like ourselves are the good guys. Because out of that demonic spirit that they're under, they think, and don't ask me how that this can occur, but they think that they're the good guys and that we're the bad guys. That's the power of the supernatural. That's the power of evil. That's the power of the darkness that has blinded those people and caused so much chaos in their own personal lives. And I personally blame it on the fact that they have bitten the hand that was feeding them. They basically looked the gift horse in the mouth. And the gift horse was the Heavenly Father that was giving them the Savior, was giving them their Liberator, was giving them their new Moses or their new whatever. But they didn't want that. Jesus didn't appeal to them. Jesus didn't wear the right cologne. Jesus didn't wear the right clothes. Jesus didn't come from the right part of the railroad tracks. Jesus was too poor. Jesus wasn't educated enough. Jesus wasn't this. Jesus wasn't that. Jesus was this and Jesus was that. So because of their defiance and because of their hard-headedness, they have brought doom and gloom. They have brought bondages of sorcery, deep, dark sorcery, into that whole region, to the point that what we see as far as people taking suicide vests and putting them on and killing 150, 200 people or injuring 400 or 500 people. We see that now on a day-to-day level of that type of ideology and that type of barbaricness that they're still under. And and it's really sad because, you know, you take the Middle East. For years and years and years, they claimed that they wouldn't drive vehicles because of all the sand. And that's the reason why that they were still driving camels. Okay. What about building tunnels? Digging tunnels in the sand and letting the automobile stay below the sand where there's not near as much stagnation in the air. Besides that, you could always build a filtering system on your automobiles to where it would release the carbon dioxide out of the tunnels and wouldn't have near as much stuff to have to breathe in as far as sand. How about the people over in Mexico that are so lazy, that believes in not only their siestas, but their fiestas, that sit around gloating, eating, and basically living like a bunch of heathenistic, barbaric, whatever you want to call it, type people that are so lazy they wouldn't hardly pick up a stick and use it to defend themselves if there was a snake fixing to bite them. This is all motivated around a spirit that gives these people this type of motivation. Regardless whether it's a motivation of not thinking for themselves, of getting off the camels, and let's become more modern, or a motivation of being lazy. What spirit does that to the human body? The spirit of the demented, the spirit of the wicked, the spirit of the dark forces is the spirit that does that. That's the reason why those people are suffering in such of a degree of what they're suffering in. Once more, we want to thank my viewers for allowing for us to be a part of your lives in distributing this out to the general public of the 41st President of the United States coming to his departure from this world to the world hereafter. May God rest and bless his soul, and may God continue to comfort the family in their time of need. May God bless the United States of America in our future endeavors of the things that we need to be a part of. God bless. Shalom. See ya.